Most Aussies think buying their first home is the hardest part. It's not. Try doing it again, but with a toddler under one arm and a mortgage on the other. One income, bigger expenses, pressure to upsize. There's plenty of content out there for first home buyers, but this is the part no one talks about. And that's why this video is about the 4 archetypes of the next home buyer. This video is for you if you already own a home, have a growing family and are desperate to upgrade, are frustrated by property prices, interest rates, and cost of living, and want to know what it takes to buy your next home. I'll be covering how to decide if you should sell or hold, case studies of the 4 types of next home buyers with real numbers, and what to watch out for when you're financing your next home. Let's get into it.
Let's go into the basics of what a bank wants to know and how you get into a property in the first place. Assuming you're of eligible age, eligible character, there are 2 key criteria. The first is establishing your borrowing capacity, otherwise known as serviceability. And what this is about is not just how much you earn. You can be a high income earner, that's great, but it's actually about your net income available for servicing a loan. So what you earn, less taxes, less living expenses, less other borrowing commitments, what is left over is what is able to service a loan. That's number 1. The next is what loan to value ratio are you bringing to the bank for a specific property? The inverse of that is what deposit or what equity are you contributing to the property to make it safe for the bank and for yourself, okay? And so these 2 things must come together, which I'll give an example of, in order to unlock a property purchase. You can't just be strong in one and weak in the other. You must have both to unlock a property purchase. All right, so we're gonna look at a sanitized example. So we have Jen and we have Alex. These are clients who, they're good income earners. They're probably 7-8 years into their career. And I guess their incomes and their roles reflect that. So Jen is an insurance underwriter. She earns $114,000 plus 2 years of bonus, which average out to $8,000. Alex is a project manager working with the New South Wales government, $119,000 base, and then $16K of overtime. They owned, because it's past tense, a 2-bedroom unit in the Homebush area worth $600,000, and they wanted to make that next leap. It's a pretty big jump. They wanted to buy a $1.5 million home in Lidcombe, Auburn. I talked about juggling family. This couple actually wanted to do it to switch homes and upgrade their home before starting a family. They kind of wanted to move in there, set up the nest, and then move into the next phase of family planning. With this income, so remember I said there's 2 things. Let's look at the borrowing capacity that we presented to them. Okay, so this is what we call the client's base case borrowing capacity. That's an SF Capital term, by the way. This is how I train my team, which is if they just walked into the branch, so to speak, or they walked into the shop and asked for a loan, and we didn't apply any problem solving, we just did a quick assessment, which other brokers do quickly, perhaps over the phone or spit something out quickly. This is what they can do. We have Jen's salary, Jen's bonus, Alex's base salary. We haven't included the overtime yet. Maybe it was a bit harder to demonstrate it because it was something newer for the client. Now, if they bought a property in Lidcombe, then their apartment in Homebush would become an investment property. We've just assumed something notional, a $500 a week rental income, okay? Of course, in addition to this income, you got to subtract expenses. And so they had living expenses roughly of $3,000 a month. Now, whether that's their actual or not. There is an exercise to look into that. But each bank will apply a minimum living expenses for a given level of income anyway. Their Homebush loan would become an investment property. So they had roughly 395 of lending on their current loan. And they had a credit card and they still had HEX. So when you wash this through a bank's calculator and look across banks that are suitable for the client and average it out, it came out to a $630,000 borrowing capacity. Now, just the mental maths of this, if you imagine a $1.5 million purchase in Lidcombe or Auburn for a house, you're not even halfway in terms of the borrowing capacity of a house, okay? And so there's a very big gap between that budget and the borrowing capacity at this point in time. And so this is what we do to try and close the gap and bring the client's borrowing capacity closer to a level where when you put in the deposit and you pay for stamp duty, you can access a suitable property, okay? So we call this at SF Capital scenario analysis. So we actually start looking at how we can change or adjust responsibly the expenses and commitments in the client's household or balance sheet. This balance sheet is a technical word for where their savings and their debts are. And we see what they can achieve when we incrementally change things. So if they closed out their HEX, HEX is based on how much you earn. So the higher your salary, the more you have to contribute to the HEX. And they have, I would call, lowish balances given how much it costs for university education. So closing the HEX was able to get the borrowing capacity to 810,000. Then, in addition to that, if we added Alex's overtime can get discounted and requires a little bit more paperwork to establish. But whether it was a waiting game or we found a bank that would access the overtime easily, that would lift the borrowing capacity to 900,000. Okay, so scenarios 1 to 3 is still keeping Homebush. Okay, so this 395 debt remains. However, to give the borrowing capacity a lift again, we would close the loan in Homebush to get another 200,000 in borrowing capacity. Now, you might ask why we're closing a loan that's almost 400,000. Why are we only getting an uplift of 200,000? Well, two things disappear when you do that, so it's not exactly one for one. The first is you lose a rental income stream, which gave your borrowing capacity a boost. But also you lose negative gearing, which is something I'll show and demonstrate later. So you lose the rental income, you lose negative gearing, and that's why it's not always a one-to-one relationship. When you cancel a loan, you don't always get the full borrowing capacity back for an investment property, okay? All right, so this is looking at their borrowing capacity and income. Their equity position was very strong for clients of that age group, their income levels. They were very diligent savers, whether through their own efforts or potentially getting a little bit of a boost from family. At this point, when they approached us, they did have 360,000 in savings, a couple combined, okay, as well as some decent equity in the property. Not like kind of crazy levels of equity, but something that had a buffer in the property that they already owned. Okay, so this is looking at the second criteria, which is what's your available deposit? What's your equity contribution into the deal? Okay, so for a $600,000 property, I've rounded the numbers just to make the maths easier. If their loan's $400,000, on paper, they have $200,000 of equity, okay? However, why I say on paper is this is locked up in bricks and mortar. It is in the form of a house. You cannot spend a house, you cannot eat a house. To realize some of that equity, you have to borrow against it more, you have to increase your borrowings, or you have to sell it completely, okay? So if they borrowed against it, banks try and keep you at a maximum of 80% LVR. That's just a general rule of thumb. And so if they borrowed against the equity that they have available, they could take out, the bank would hold back 120,000 of the 600,000 as a cushion, but they could take out another 80,000. So if they borrowed another 80,000, they could take their total cash from 360 to 440. However, when you take this equity out of an existing loan, you do eat into the borrowing capacity that we show you. So you might lever up with one property, but you will take away from the future borrowing capacity that we're presenting to you, okay? To unlock the most equity and to free up your borrowing capacity further, you would sell the property. And this would give you, basically you'd close the loan, you'd pay the selling cost and the real estate agent, and you'd have 185 left over, and you'd add this to your cash balance to really have a very generous deposit to be able to go out there and buy, okay? So these two scenarios would be keeping, and this is selling, okay? Why am I showing you this? Is because you need to put together, as I said at the start, you need to put together the borrowing capacity and how much cash or equity you have to decide if you can access a specific property budget, okay? So, Jen and Alex wanted to purchase a $1.5 million property, okay? That generates stamp duty of $66,000. Unfortunately, the New South Wales government takes a big cut, or whatever interstate government or other state or territory you might live, okay? And so a $1.5 million purchase, the total amount of money that actually changes hands in the order of 1.57, okay? Now, the maximum loan the bank can give you without incurring what's called lender's mortgage insurance, so an extra cost, is 80%. And so 1.5 times 80% is 1.2 million. If the property costs, if all the money changing hands is 1.57 and the bank is lending you 1.2, then the funds to complete you need is in the order of 370,000 for this property, okay? And 1.2 million at just a guide of an interest rate of 6.5% is over 7,500 per month, okay? So you need to be sure to the bank you can borrow this much and you have this much of cash available. What we show to our clients is if this price point is inaccessible, it's like kind of trying to book a flight. The Monday doesn't work. Maybe the Tuesday, Wednesday works better and has cheaper seats. We try and filter and toggle the scenario to present a set of figures that will work for the client and their numbers. Okay, so let's lower the budget. 1.25 has 52,000 of stamp duty, 1.3 million of total costs, 80% is 1 million. They got to contribute 306. If we lower it to a $1 million budget, total costs are 1.044. They're borrowing 800,000. Funds to complete 244. Okay, so if we look back at Jen and Alex and we think about these figures, this is what's happening in their decision making. Okay. If you look at the first two price points, without selling Homebush, their borrowing capacity was 900,000. And so these first two columns, they cannot access it, okay? They need to borrow 1.2 million or 1 million in order to get to the price point of 1.5 to 1.25, okay? That's talking about borrowing capacity. If you're looking at the deposit, 1.5 is a $1.5 million property requires a contribution of 370. I said at the start that without selling that they only had 360 available. So they are short and you have to leave some money left over for a rainy day. Now I did show you could cash out 80K and add to their cash, but if you cash out that 80K, you're reducing the borrowing capacity for the next property. So that's kind of like taking from one hand, giving with one hand, taking away from the other. Okay. So the first price point is ruled out on their borrowing capacity and deposit. The second price point is ruled out, they have enough deposit, but their borrowing capacity cannot reach it. Now, what about 1 million? Well, this they can do. They can borrow 900,000 and they have 360, so they can comfortably access 1 million, a $1 million property. However, it's not what they want. Okay, so you're in this sort of jigsaw puzzle of trying to make the numbers and the scenario fit for every client that we're presented. Okay, so look, I've told you the problems. Let's look at the solutions. What did they actually do in the end? What decision did they make, and what was right for this client? Okay, and so I guess the takeaway before I go into what they did is you're always constrained by the law of your borrowing capacity or your available deposit whenever you're trying to purchase any property. Okay, both your borrowing capacity and the deposit must be high enough to access any given price point for a specific property. Okay, there is, in other words, there is always a binding constraint of either the borrowing capacity or the deposit as you push the property price higher and higher. Okay, so what did they do? Did they keep? Did they sell Homebush? And is that right for you? Okay, if you own a property today. So basically, to answer this question, I put together a checklist or a framework to decide if you want to keep or sell. Okay, so I won't say you should, but you can make your own decision to keep a property if you have a high risk appetite. What I mean by that is you are someone that wants to stay invested into the market and you are comfortable with debt. Okay, debt can pose risk because your income can change, your situation can change. What's your risk appetite and your comfort level with carrying debt and staying invested in the market? The second question is, can you actually afford 2 loans? Okay, not every client can hold 2 loans. Okay, so your serviceability and your net income may not be high enough to hold those 2 properties in the first place. Okay, that's a serviceability question. But the next point is you can keep it if you have enough cash savings that you don't need to sell a property to buy a next one. When you go out shopping for a property, when you go to open inspections, one of the first questions a real estate agent will ask you is your finance ready? Very likely, the second question that they will ask you is, do you need to sell to buy? And the reason why they ask that is because, number one, they want to understand your level of risk and exposure and flexibility to buy the property that they're selling. But also, they want to know if they can get the second sale if you're a local seller. So just prepare for those questions when you go out to buy a property. You should also consider keeping the property if you think there'll be high rental growth. You should also consider keeping it if you think there'll be high capital growth. Okay, so it's in a growth area. You're gonna make an uplift on the value of the property itself over time. Also, these next 2 go together. If that property has a high rental income, then it supports you in paying the mortgage. Okay, so what are the holding costs associated with the property? And do you have a high enough rental income to cover or subsidize those holding costs? So holding costs are strata fees if it's an apartment, repairs and maintenance, land tax if you hold property with a lot of land component and you're at that threshold. And then finally, coming full circle, it's linked to your risk appetite. You may have a high risk appetite, but your own personal situation is not stable or is expected to change. Even if you like to invest or you like to have a punt, if your own situation is not very stable, it does not lend itself well to holding onto a property or an extra property and carrying more debt. Okay, so the sell framework is simply the inverse of this. You should consider selling if your risk appetite is low. you don't have the serviceability to carry two loans, you need to sell to buy. So you need to unlock the equity in the property in the form of that little buffer the bank keeps, 20%, you need to access that as well. The property has low capital growth, low rental income, high holding costs, and your personal situation might be not very stable. These are signs that you should sell the property, okay? So going back to Jen and Alex, what did they do in the end? They decided instead of a house, very practical decision in Sydney, they would instead buy a townhouse, okay? And then in terms of the keep or buy, they did decide to keep the Homebush investment, however, eventually sell it to lower their debt, especially when they were starting a family, so that the debt on the final Lidcombe home would be reduced and their commitments would be more comfortable when they were on one income or 1.5 incomes, okay? And you can see it's a very smart decision. So sure, it's not a full house, but you can buy a 4-bedroom home in Sydney for $1.2 million. This is a recent listing that I just picked up preparing for this webinar, okay? Yeah, so you can buy at that 1.2 price point. The key takeaway is by dropping the budget, if you remember the first slide that I showed you, they were able to borrow and demonstrate a borrowing capacity of 900,000, tick 1. But also tick 2, they had funds to complete to access this purchase price, okay? So a sensible client is realistic about what they are able to do and what's available in the market, and is able to adapt and adjust their own situation while working with us to access a suitable price point. All right, so that was going through an example, just to teach those lessons, just to give that refresher of borrowing capacity and the LVR. I'm now going to talk about the 4 archetypes. There's 4 archetypes, and I threw in a bonus one, okay? They are the rainmaker, the realist, the bonus is the renovator, the rentvestor, and finally, just the unreasonable client, okay? Don't be the unreasonable client. Why I chose this word is a bit of a nerdy term, but if you understand like characters and like storytelling, an archetype is a mold or a model of which different variations are built on top, okay? And why I say that is, as I go through the archetypes, if you don't find yourself in one of these archetypes, that's because the reality is clients come in all shapes and sizes, okay? And yeah, like I've kind of simplified it down into 4 archetypes plus a bonus, but clients come from all walks of life and all shapes and sizes, okay? And so there might be a situation where it doesn't work for you to buy a property now, but what a good broker can do is at least understand what we have to work with, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and set a goal and a trajectory for you to achieve what you want, okay? Some of these numbers may be relatable, some not, but it's the clients that we work with, and I wanted to find easy to understand examples because they are archetypes. All right, let me introduce to you all the rainmaker, okay? So, got Harvey Specter for those who like suits. The rainmaker is the classic high income earner. However, for what some people think is high, there's often even higher. Like they are truly a client with star power. They're usually very smart, very driven, motivated people. But they are at a very good place in their career. They're partners of law firms, consulting firms, accounting firms. They're C-suite managers and executives. They're successful large business owners. Potentially they're doctors, but also specialists. So they've got that next level of education and training. Okay, but I tell you, for all the rainmakers that we work with, it has not been without sacrifice. They work incredibly hard. They're very committed to their jobs, their roles, their businesses, and because of that, they are high income earners, and they buy high-end property. They have the incomes and the balance sheet to do it. Okay, and so I call high 3 million and above. Now, when I first started my broking career, 3 million was considered a luxury property, but now houses within 10 kilometers of the Sydney CBD are in that $3 million price point, many houses. So 5 million is kind of like the new 3 million, if you will. Okay, this client also tends to buy a new property unobstructed. They don't need to, so with the Jen and Alex example, I showed the trade-offs that the client had to make. This client usually does not have to make those trade-offs, okay? And they're able to hold on to their current home. They quite comfortably and easily convert their former home to an investment, okay? And in the end, they carry quite high levels of debt. As I said, clients come in all shapes and sizes. And so we put together a database of these examples just to kind of show the shape of these clients. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Anthony as the first example. This is a newly promoted. This was a newly promoted accounting partner. Okay, yeah, he probably had worked 12, 13 years in the firm, moving through the ranks to kind of make partner. Okay, so that commitment should be rewarded. Him and his wife had one child with another on the way, and his wife worked in a government role as a client manager, earning $75,000. Okay, so Anthony in this case is a very high income earner. His earnings were in the order of over $600,000 per annum, and his goal was to move from a Tarman 2-bedroom unit to get into a 4-bedroom home in kind of the Ku-ring-gai council area. Okay, so Roseville, Linfield, Gordon St. Ives, if you can imagine. The rainmakers have cash. Okay, they either have cash or they have very generous equity in property. So he had over 1 million in cash. And if you kind of look at the financial position, the borrowing capacity ends up being in the order of 2.6 million. Okay, so if you add 1 mil cash to 2.6 million borrowing capacity, there's no problem buying a 3 mil. Sure, you can't hit 4 million, but there's no impediment to buying in that kind of $3 to $3.5 million range. And that's the kind of key characteristic of the rainmaker. Just to show, I guess, how this looks from a serviceability perspective, okay? The Tarman property is converted to a investment, okay? What I want to show, which is like a recurring theme, okay, so even with that level of debt, they still have a $1,000 surplus, okay? I just want to show the ability, it's a sort of controversial topic. I saw like the Greens talk about negative gearing is bad and should be abolished. Homes should not be investments at all. They should be left for people to live, not speculate. The tax system does support people holding on to properties and pushing prices up, okay? So you can see here that is this an investment loan? Yes. Is it tax deductible? Yes, okay? And I showed you there was a 1K surplus roughly. If I turn this off and I go, okay, there is no negative gearing. They get the rent, but there's no negative gearing, okay? You can see now that Anthony cannot borrow 2.6 million. Okay, he is now in the red on the bank serviceability. Okay, he can still borrow a lot if I play around with it. He can borrow probably, my guess as a broker off the cuff, he'll make it at 2.4. So he's still doing well. He's still able to access a very decent price point. You can see it's now comfortably back in the green. So that kicker from negative gearing is firstly recognized by the banks, and it does help clients hold on to debt as well as increase their borrowing capacities and be able to bid and contribute in the Sydney, let alone Australian property market. Okay, so I'll show you another example of that as we go through the archetypes. So let's talk about the realist. Okay, so we're going to lower the price point. This is more in the sort of Jen and Alex price point, but a little bit more again. I'm just really talking about homes in Sydney. You know, what can you, what is the price point of a 3 to 4 bedroom home in sort of a suburb in Sydney? That's not. I'm not talking the Mossmans and Hunters Hill or Vaucluses of the world, but kind of the middle ring suburbs of Sydney. So that's typically a $1.5 to $2.5 million price point. The key difference between the realist and the rainmaker is that the trade-off they typically have to make to access the next purchase is they need to unlock the equity in the existing home. And that's not by borrowing against it. That's much more of a rainmaker or even rent investor move. They have to sell this asset in order to unlock the equity as cash to buy the property. Okay, so they may have lower risk appetites. They don't earn as high income. They need to sell to buy, and what still unlocks the borrowing capacity is 2 incomes, whether two full incomes like Jen and Alex, or at least 1.5 incomes. Okay, and they need to sell before they buy, or they need to use a bridging loan. Okay, so an example of that is if we go to our next archetype. Brandon's an engineer, earns 165. Wife is a speech pathologist, earns 56,000. From memory, probably 3 days a week. Okay, so it's a part-time role. They wanted to get their kids into the right school catchment. Okay, so they lived in the Parramatta area. Okay, but they knew the power of the schools in the Hills district, especially high schools. James Roos, Baulkham Hills, further north Hornsby. These are selective high schools, but also there are very high quality private schools in the area as well. And so they wanted to get the kids into the right catchment because their kids were one was becoming primary school age, and they wanted to do this. They wanted to get into the home before they had to send their eldest kid into primary school. Okay, and so what they had to do, which I will talk about in another webinar, maybe like a mini webinar, is they had to use a bridging loan to purchase this property. Okay, so with bridging, you are buying and settling your new home before you sell the home that you own today. Okay, and because of that, you need funding up front to settle on the purchase while you carry the debt of the home you have. And then when you finally sell that home, you pay down the debt, the bridging loan debt, to a level which you can carry. Okay, so the key takeaway is there is a lot of debt that you got to carry during the bridging period. Not everyone is comfortable with this level of debt. So that's number one. And then number two, you need to have a lot of equity in the home that you are selling to make the bridging loan work. Okay, that's what a realist looks like. They usually have to sell in order to buy. Okay, all right. A spin on the realist is something I see with clients with a much longer term view is they're the realist, but they like to be quite handy on the tools, or they can see the potential of a property. And so they get into the lower price point with a view to add value over time, to really construct equity in the home and turn sort of like a aged property into a property that they really enjoy and want to live in, okay? So the renovator is a spin on the realist where, so actually that same client that I showed you before, where they ended up buying a Balkan Hills property kind of around the 1.6 to 1.8 range. But over time, over the period of 18 months, they renovated the bathrooms, they redid the veranda, they redid pool fencing and pool decking, and they added landscaping and sort of built their own, like fun zone for their kids in their backyard. In the hills area, backyards are very big, so they were really able to increase the value of the home, but actually turn that older property into a home that they really enjoyed. So this is the bonus one which I talked about. Okay, we're going to talk about the Rentvestor. Okay, so the Rentvestor, they typically earn high incomes as well, but not necessarily at the Rainmaker level. And so typically rent vesting is about you're renting while you buy an investment property that someone else is paying the rent on and helping you pay your mortgage on. I'm using rent vesting in a little bit of a spin, with a little bit of spin, which is the Rentvestor, who is the next home buyer, remains in the property that they already live in. Okay, so that may be the 2-bedroom apartment. They're happy to stay in there longer, knowing that they still have a bit more growth in that property. Okay, but they are planning for the future, buying a property that they eventually want to move into and live in. Okay, so this is a borrower typically that is comfortable with higher levels of debt. So they've got the debt on their home today. They're happy to make a big investment into the future and carry the debt along the way. Okay, and the reason why they're comfortable with that is they have some level of confidence about their future. So usually their incomes are growing. Perhaps they're earning another qualification. They have a view on interest rates. Potentially they're going to be low and stable or going down. Okay, and sometimes they are like a spin-off of the renovator again. They eventually want to do a knockdown rebuild or a big renovation to turn that property into their dream home or ideal home, but they're happy to carry the debt, grow their incomes, and be very patient about it. Okay? So, an example that I have is a plumber called Timothy, bought a property worth $2.3 million in the Ryde Council. Okay. Now, Timothy is a small business owner, so he didn't pay himself a big salary, but he did have profits in the business that he could use to boost his serviceability. Okay. And then I believe his wife was a brand manager at a big US company. And over time, not Rainmaker levels of cash, but he had even $650,000 to be able to invest into the next home. Okay. Being self-employed, we're able to give him really boost his borrowing capacity through eligible add-backs. So that's another topic for the business owners out there. And the reason why Tim made this investment is he didn't need to move into that property yet, but eventually one day he would. It's going back to the RBA comment prior to 2022. There was an outlook that rates would be low and stable for a period of time, and he thought that he had growing income and interest rates would remain low. He was comfortable making that investment. Of course, things changed, so you have to rework your scenario when things don't work out the same way. But that was the view at that time. Why the rentvestor cannot buy like the rainmaker is there's some sort of constraint, okay? This is their property portfolio at the time of buying. So they don't own the next home yet, they want to buy, okay? So constraint number one, now this looks like they own a lot of property, okay? But actually, why they had to be rentvestors is because this property was not an investment property for them. Actually, they were borrowing on behalf of their mother-in-law. For different families, that is a thing. And $725,000 of their borrowing capacity was being taken up by this property. Okay, so you see low debt, high equity. Actually, their true balance sheet when you deducted that was this. So, which is from 60%, we're going to 71% LVR. Okay, so they still got good buffers, right? You can see roughly 650,000 of equity built into their properties, but actually, if you the equity that it looked like they have was misleading unless you dig in deeper. They were borrowing on behalf of their parents, and of course, 700,000 is like a two-bedroom unit in Sydney. So a lot of their borrowing capacity was being taken up on behalf of their mother-in-law. Okay, so that was constraint number one. Constraint number two is that it was still early days in the pregnancy, but we wanted to utilize two income streams to get the most borrowing capacity. However, even though there was an intent to go back to work full time, that's not always a certainty. Obviously, you don't know your child or the nature of your child or how you will cope until your kids come out and they grow up. And so having two incomes full time help maximize borrowing capacity. And of course, there is a big constraint when you go from a full-time income to a part-time income, your borrowing capacity is going to drop. And so they wanted to be able to access their maximum borrowing capacity today. So that was what they wanted to do. And I guess they were comfortable doing that because they did, if things were to change, they did have equity buffers, not only in the properties that they owned, but other investments that they had made over time as well, such as shares, okay? All right, so I promised a little bit of a sneak peek into negative gearing. Now, this is not the same client, but another rentvestor scenario. This is another couple that had 2 or 3 investment properties, and they wanted to borrow another $2.3 million. So it's not too far off, okay? Everything is green and passing, which is what you want to see, okay? But if I turn off negative gearing, okay, so every bank has a little mini calculator inside their bigger calculator, which activates negative gearing, okay? But let's say I just notionally plug in $1, okay? So this is a way of turning off negative gearing in a very quick way without the calculator breaking. You can really quickly see that it's not only a red, it's a big red. Okay, and my guess is that $2.3 million loan would probably become a $1.9 million loan. Let's test it. Okay, so they're passing. But if you saw before, just turning off negative gearing wiped off $400,000 in borrowing capacity. Okay, this is a big move for a rentvestor. They understand that through that rent vesting process, there is this kicker from negative gearing, and turning it off in the calculator for this particular client on this level of debt switched off $400,000 of borrowing capacity. Now that can buy a studio or a regional property. So negative gearing for a rentvestor does give borrowing capacity a very generous boost, okay? Now, the fourth archetype, actually, they look like all sorts of clients. There's no specific income mold or savings or equity or balance sheet mold for the fourth archetype, the unreasonable client. But why they're called unreasonable is they cannot change or mold their choices for their reality, okay? So they often set a budget beyond what their balance sheet, their savings, or their borrowing capacity allows. And they cannot change, they refuse to change that, hoping something about their incomes or their savings will change. Now, of course, you can change your destiny. You can work really hard, you can change careers, you can take extra risk to increase your income, to increase your savings. But those clients, firstly, they don't do those things, number one. But secondly, there's they want it now. And that's probably the key unreasonable thing. They want it now, and they're not happy to be patient to access what they want. And yeah, they're not happy. They don't want to make compromises. Okay, so here's an example. Okay, so look, we have a client. They earn 120,000. Okay, unfortunately, they were. Let me start again. So this client this client earns 120,000. Okay, they were going to come into some money. They were going to come into a deposit of 1 million plus. So that's a very big deposit. Okay, you can buy a lot of properties just with the deposit alone. Now, unfortunately, it was through sad circumstances. It was from selling a property through a separation or divorce. Okay, so the proceeds of sale would be split, and they had 3 kids, which also factor into your living expenses to reduce your borrowing capacity. Now, the trade-off, okay, so before I go into possible trade-offs, even though this is, it's a good income, and this is a very decent deposit, they wanted to remain in the heart of the eastern suburbs. So they really wanted to buy specifically a home or townhouse, Bondi, Tamarama, Bronte, even go down to Coogee. Beyond that was kind of slumming it for the client. And I could show them a borrowing capacity of probably 400,000 working with this income. But 400,000 plus 1 million is 1.4. There is no way you're even buying a townhouse in the eastern suburbs, in the kind of the prestige suburbs near the beach. Okay. Now, had the client considered Botany, Matraville, Pagewood, East Lakes, which is still in the east, but sure, it's not a prestige or blue ribbon or premium suburb, they could have got into potentially a house, townhouse even. But they just would not consider alternative suburbs. I showed them all those different scenarios. So going back to our scenario analysis, I showed them their base case was in the 400 range. You had the bonus, it wasn't a very big bonus, but you got an uplift, income from child support. I was showing them what they could realistically borrow, but they just did not want to change. They did not want them to change their mind about where they wanted to live. And this is the hallmark of the unreasonable client. Perhaps they grew up in a certain suburb, their parents lived there, they have a romance or affinity with a certain suburb, and they're not willing to make a compromise in their decisions to be able to buy a property. These clients, I don't have a success story because they don't end up proceeding, okay? All right, I'm gonna wrap it up. Thank you everyone for joining. So just to summarize, we went through the Rainmaker, the Realist, the Renovator, Investor, and Unreasonable. We'll share this content online through our website, wherever it may be. Okay, and I just want to summarize some key takeaways or lessons helping the next home buyer. Okay. The first is, unfortunately, the marketplace is not fair. It does not have emotions or care about you as the individual. The marketplace is where buyers and sellers come together and transact. Okay. So the marketplace is not going to look after you individually. And if you think the government will as well, sure, they help first home buyers. Remember I said, like, there's a lot of material, a lot of assistance for first home buyers, but there's not for next home buyers. Maybe you didn't get help, but you've already got into the market. Okay, so you really got to be resourceful and realistic about your own budget and what you have to work with to access the property market. Okay. The next point is, if you could choose between having a high income and having a high deposit, the way that banks work is, I would recommend to our clients, focus as much as you can on income. Okay. Usually banks have a workaround for a smaller deposit purely because of the direction and the safety of the Australian property market. So they're happy to work with smaller deposits, but they cannot help you if you don't have enough income, and especially net income, to demonstrate serviceability. So had the unreasonable client maybe repartnered or had not been separated, actually they probably could have boosted their borrowing capacity at a level with that deposit to buy an okay property. Something in common with all those scenarios is that two incomes, and especially full-time incomes, they help in terms of unlocking the most borrowing capacity for you to access the property market. Now, if not two full-time incomes, at least one full-time and one part-time income is often needed to demonstrate enough borrowing capacity to get into the market. The final two things is to take every advantage that you can get. So it's not, as I said, the marketplace is not fair, but there are stats showing that the Bank of Mum and Dad is the 9th biggest lender in the Australian property market. And so if your parents want to help you and you're not, and you don't want to use that because of ego or wanting to demonstrate self-reliance, which are very good things, but actually you're going to stay locked out at the price point that you want. And your parents actually want to help you. They want you to live close to them. They want to see their grandkids. I recommend for clients in those positions to take every advantage that they can. Okay. And then the final thing is to be open to solutions. Okay. So I showed that scenario testing. They are different solutions available, different kind of flights you can take, if you will. Yeah, be open to flying on a different date if you don't get your preferred time and airline. Okay. Look, thank you everyone for joining. Hope you learned something.